Surf Splendor.
Can we talk about your darkness immersion retreat?
Yeah, yeah, for sure. If you want to, I'd be happy to. Yeah.
Let's dive straight in. We'll come back and do the origin story stuff, but let's dive straight into that.
I don't even know if people need an origin story. I always feel like that's just the most boring thing to go over. But I mean, I'm happy to chat about
Sure.
whatever you want, but I want to go into the deep stuff, you know? That's the fun stuff.
Deep, dark, literally. I've never
Yeah.
known anybody to do one. What exactly is it, and where were you personally to where that sounded like something that might be therapeutic?
That's a great question. So yeah, for context, I did a 3-day darkness retreat, no sound, no light. You're underground in like a cave, but it's more like a hotel room that's been outfitted underground, but it is under the earth, you know. And just for context, it was in Southern Oregon, and basically you go there and you spend 1.5 days integrating. And what I mean by that is like you get used to the space, right? Because you're eating food, the same food every day for 5 days. It's a 5-day in total experience. So you arrive for a day and a half, you get used to the space, you kind of feel the walls, make sure there's no sharp corners or things you're gonna hit your head on, right? And then basically, you spend the first night, you spend the second night, you have full light, and then that next morning, lights off. And basically, the food gets delivered to you one time in the evening. You don't know what time. And it's the point is to have no human interaction, right? So the only time that you have somebody, you hear someone's voice or something is when they drop off this food and they kind of check on you and you don't see anybody. There's like a double door, so like they're just placing it and taking away the old stuff, but you are in complete darkness. And it's not the kind of darkness that's like this, you know close your eyes. It's the darkness where you like are putting a hand over your eye. You can't see absolutely anything the entire time. And I mean, I could talk about this forever, so I don't want to
Go,
bore
no, go
everybody with
on.
the details, but I think that there's two things that were really significant to me. Um, and those things were that first and foremost, you have no reference of time. And because you have no reference of time, and because you have no ability to like check your phone or your watch, there's no electronics, there's no time, there's no clock, right? And so what I'm saying is like you wake up in the morning and you don't know what time it is. Did you sleep well? Yeah, you could, try to imagine if you slept well by basing how you feel. But typically, I would imagine that, when you wake up in the morning, you look at your clock and you're like, "Oh, wow, I slept all the way through the night. It's 7 a.m. I'm time to get up, have my coffee, all this stuff." All of a sudden, this checklist mentally starts to happen where you're working your day backwards. Like, well, I got to be at work by 9, and so I got to, have my coffee, and then I got to eat my food, then I got to take my kid to school or whatever. So you have nothing. You have none of that. You don't know if you wake up in the morning, if it's 2 in the morning or if it's 10 a.m. And it's extremely jarring at first. It's extremely scary because you have no reference of time. And at a certain point, what happens is that you start to ask yourself what you need, and you start to judge or base what you feel on what your next step should be, right? Like when you wake up, you're like, "Oh, am I thirsty? Am I tired? Should I go back to bed? Should I go and take a bath? Should I meditate? Should I eat some food?" And I think what happens is by, but at least for me, I can't speak for everybody else because maybe people are out there way more intuitive into their own body and mind. But for me, I've never done that. I've never in my life feel like I've given myself the time and the attention to actually ask, like, well, what do I need? What do I feel? And when you start to ask those questions, other questions arise. All of a sudden, you're having these like full-blown conversations with yourself, trying to understand what your needs are. And so your priorities change. And again, I know this whole experience is a privilege in and of itself, right? Just to give yourself the time. But it's fascinating to me that that starts to occur. And I think what's wild is that when you start to listen to yourself and listen to your needs, your body starts to tell you other things. Your mind starts to tell you other things. You start to unpack a lot of other stuff that you never would have because we're so busy filling up our time with this agenda that we've created, right? And I know that, again, work and family and all these things, they create that agenda for us. But it's like so fascinating to all of a sudden, realize that like that is something that we put on ourselves. We don't stop and check in almost ever. And that was the biggest takeaway from that experience, was like starting to listen to myself.
So I totally hear you. I'm curious if there becomes a point though where it's difficult to delineate what's your true self that you're identifying versus delirium. You know what I mean?
Well, yeah, that's a great question. And I think that, yeah, people go in there and they have real fight or flight responses. It happens. And this is why you go in to the experience with a therapist. Like you have
Okay.
like an entry meeting. So you don't just, you're not just dropped off and they're like, yeah, you're good, bro. Good luck. Like you have a therapist, you talk about the experience before you go in. And then after you come out, because you're not, it's not just 3 days, it's 4 nights and 3 days. So it's like 80 hours almost or more. Um, and so you process this experience before and after. And I know from what's been shared to me that a lot of people do go into a fight or flight response. And part of the experience is dealing with this fight or flight response. And I think what was wild was hearing in the beginning the gal who was kind of the somatic therapist, somatic meaning like in your body. She kind of mentioned something that really struck me hard, and it was she said, hey, like when this fight or flight response comes up, because you're in total darkness, it's scary, right? Some people freak out legitimately. Some people have low grade anxiety attacks. Some people have high grade anxiety attacks. um, Ultimately, I felt really okay the whole time, but
Mm.
definitely this kind of mantra that she shared with me was really important. And she was like, if the animal is safe, you're safe. Because you have to remind yourself of that.
Yeah,
Like, why is it that some of us feel more safe, at the top of some 14,000-foot peak or 20,000-foot peak, or in, swimming around with a water housing in shark infested waters with, 10-foot waves, but being in total darkness where all your needs are met, you have clean water, a fresh bed, like, why is that scary? And I think it's because we're just alone with our thoughts. And if you don't like your company in that situation, I think it's something that we should look into or deal with, right? And you
totally.
you do oscillate between feeling utter freedom, like the most beautiful total freedom you've ever felt in your entire life, and feeling like a dog caged in a kennel.
Right. Um, do you feel comfortable explaining some of the takeaways? Like what were the epiphanies that you had, that truths about yourself maybe that you identified in that environment that you didn't know prior?
I would, but to be honest, I think that I don't know that it's going to be the same for everybody. So for
Okay.
me, they are highly personal and extremely um, vulnerable little kernels of truth that I felt like I gleaned from that experience. And I honestly just, it's one of those things where like I also don't want to create some false pretense that this is what people are going to find, because a lot
Yeah.
of people go in there and they find nothing. And people go in there and they feel like it's a waste of time, or people go in there and they get really frustrated, or they have maybe the most revelatory experience of their entire life. I will just say that, like I said, that process of starting to ask yourself what your needs are, it starts to unravel and pull on a thread that really makes you stare at everything you do. For me, not that this was like a revelatory, I already knew this about myself, but it was wild, in the months and weeks leading up to it. Because you asked me, you said, like, why would one want to do this in the first place? And I remember talking to a friend of mine, Colin O'Brady. He's like a, world record holder, Everest climber dude, just, does it all, endurance athlete guy. And I had seen him do this. And I think that everybody has this draw. They see people emerge from the darkness, right? and they feel like, oh, I want that. They see, the tears and the emotion and
Yeah.
all that stuff. And I have to say, that's probably the least interesting part. That's like the cherry on top when you come out of the darkness and you see the light and you hear the sounds for the first time. It's a fascinating experience. And I'd be happy to touch on that and what that felt like. But it was weird to me because not weird, but it was fascinating to me because when I wanted to do this experience, I reached out to Colin because I was just searching for, I'm a big introspective person, I'm a big like try whatever I need to try in order to get more clarity, in my life. And I feel like that type of clarity or that level of clarity or understanding or awareness is what I try to offer people when I'm doing public speaking or I'm teaching or I'm offering that to clients or whatever it is. Anyway, when I saw Colin do it, I was like, dude, is this just another like endurance challenge? Like what is this? And he said, no, he said, unlike a lot of other things people reach for, whether it's, drugs or alcohol or maybe a plant medicine experience or whatever it is, whatever you're searching for to either numb something or to enlighten yourself or to give yourself knowledge. He's like, this is fascinating because you realize really quickly that like what you're searching for is in you. And it's not like, something else you might try, which lasts for 2 hours or 8 hours or 10 hours. It's 80 hours. You can't hide. There's no hiding. So you're not going to like, I'm pretty good at enduring things. I mean, I think I've proven that in my life. Um, and this is not one of those things. This is something where like you have to actually like let go. And what I realized, it was fascinating because having the weeks prior, I was like pushing really hard, getting tons of work done, kind of frantic, busy, just typical before this thing because I was going to take almost 5 days of doing nothing. That is like unheard of. I mean, even that in and of itself is scary. And I remember sitting there and I'm like, I'm finally here. It's time to relax. Let's relax. Let's do this. Like I'm all in, just receive, receive. And I'm just sitting there, meditating and pulling strength from my yoga teacher training days and all the other shit that I've done. And I just couldn't relax. For some reason in my head, this, windowsill in my house in Iceland that was like cracked open or broken. I needed to think about that. And what was so interesting is I needed to like categorize things I needed to tell people, things I needed to fix, things I needed to solve, problems that I needed to deal with in that moment. And it's fascinating to me how the brain is so powerful, but yet it's also like a supercomputer that's built to keep you safe. And that safety that it creates for us, sometimes that means trying to control situations. And so as somebody who, I think has maybe some issues with that, or, just by the aspect of owning my own business and managing all these things and having a lot on my plate, that idea of kind of not being in control and just letting things go is really hard. And so I
Yeah.
I sort of looked at my thought process in a totally different way I've never seen before. I realized that my brain, as much as I love it and as intelligent as it is, it's an enemy in some ways because it's keeping me from what I need here, and what I feel, and not leading with like emotion or leading with vulnerability because safety is at the core, I mean, for all of us, of why we do what we do, right? That's usually what drives our day-to-day actions. And I think that kernel of truth I realize is that I don't want to lead with, my brain, kind of my thoughts, my thought patterns, um, being in charge. I'd like to lead more with my heart and what I care about and what I value. But in order to understand that, you have to like slow down.
Yeah.
And I
Well,
think that, yeah, that's it.
well,
In
when you
a
dive when you dive back into the chaos of your busy life, you know, um, are you able to keep that kernel of truth as the focal point? Says the chaos.
extremely, extremely hard, I will say. It's the most painful thing. I've told my wife probably 10, 20 times since I've been out of the cave. Like, I wish I could go back there because things were so black and white and so simple. And I don't think I've ever cared about myself and my like cherished like who I was more and felt connected to who I am more. And life comes at you really fast. And you know, it's even more painful is seeing your habits kind of come back online. And I remember like the day getting out of the cave. What's really interesting, just so you know, is like in the darkness, you have no way to three-dimensionally map what's going on. And what I mean by that is like you feel like you're in a one-dimensional space, right? People can get vertigo, right? There's no depth at all. So you're like a child, like a baby walking up to a counter and trying to put his hand down and they miss it, right? Because it's not just our eyes, it's our ears that help to map what's around us. We're always mapping a space. Like I could close my eyes and I know that I'm in a small room. I'm sure you could probably figure out, if you were taken outside, that you're outside.
Yeah.
And so when I was taken out at the end, it was like similar to being on a psychedelic where all of a sudden, like I heard a bee next to my ear, and then 20 feet away, there was like the rustling of wind in the trees, and then there was an airplane. And this is because I had the mask on, right? So all I have are my ears, and it was like the most intense sound I've ever heard. I swear I could have like heard a spider crawling. It was wild. And then you take the mask off, and the entire landscape feels like it's like I can't even describe it. It's like going from a one-dimensional world to like three-dimension. It's like vibrant. Yeah. So it was really beautiful. But again, it's kind of the cherry on top. It's not the thing you take away.
Yeah.
That's more like the finale.
The crazy thing is all of that processing and brain power is with you all the time. It's just you're layering on all these things to block it out.
Right. Yeah, totally. And we have convinced ourselves that these things are important when
Right.
oftentimes they're not. Oftentimes, what we deem as important is something, it's a safety protocol, it's a safety mechanism. It's, my ego, or it's my this, or it's, oh, this is important because it's my business, or this is important because it's my relationship, or whatever it is. But we're not usually tapping into like, well, what do I need? Why do
Yeah,
I need this?
totally. Excuse me, the coughing related to my losing my voice might interrupt us a little bit.
Okay, man. It's all good.
Um what it that actually ties into something that I was kind of a theme of that I kept thinking about as I was kind of creating an outline for our conversation was just
Yeah.
how do you exploit, maybe not exploit, but how do you take advantage of all the opportunities that present themselves to you while trying to manage, being engaged with a family? Like a part of your life is very anchored and core. And then there's all these things spinning over here that are available to you. And so those two things are totally opposed, it seems, so managing those is kind of similar to what you're talking about.
Yeah, well, it's a two-part answer. Ultimately, first thing is I don't take advantage of all those opportunities. Like the amount of things that come through my inbox or my desk or my direct messages are endless. The amount of opportunities, like, come to this, four-star whatever hotel and blah, blah, blah. And like, I think that if I was a single person and I didn't care as much about running a business and employing people and raising a family, maybe that's what I would be doing, is spending more time taking advantage of all those cool opportunities, because there are endless opportunities. And
Right.
I think that a point of maturity comes when you realize what's valuable to do and what's maybe not. And also where to invest that time, where to invest that energy, because creativity is not an endless stream. Like
Right.
burnout is real, that happens. If you pull from your well, where you're storing all this inspiration and creativity and what you have to offer, if you keep pulling from it and pulling from it, it's going to empty. And then you have nothing for not only the people you love, but yourself. I've been there. I've come back from many a 20-day trips, 30-day trips away from my family, and I've got nothing left. And so part of why I moved to Iceland full time was because I wanted to have a closer relationship with my family, and I wanted to prioritize them. And I wanted
Good.
to show them that what matters most to me is not being the person who takes all the opportunities and being the person who, I don't know, shoots all the articles and gets all the covers and does all the jobs and blah, blah, blah. I just, I just felt like this was a way of simplifying my life and also
Yeah.
prioritizing access to nature, prioritizing community, prioritizing wilderness and places that I want my kids to realize like this is what I care about. And I'll tell you, full disclosure, like it was the hardest and it has been the hardest thing I've ever done in my entire life. It has been the most expensive thing I've ever done in my entire life. I sold my office in California and my gallery and I owned it and everything just to like make ends meet, not to get ahead, but just to make ends meet. And I think that I've taken a step back over the years from trying to be in the spotlight because I feel like I have these critical years with my kids and I just didn't want to miss out on those. And if I can just be so bold as to say that, I didn't grow up with a dad. So that experience for me, it's been really healing also. Like I didn't have someone in my life at that age. And I guess I didn't want to give myself any excuse to not be there. Right.
How old are the kids?
My kids are 10 and 12.
Okay.
My boys. Yeah.
Um, when you said it was the hardest thing, the most expensive thing, I expected the third thing was, and the greatest thing I've ever done. Have you begun to reap
Well,
the benefits yet?
I think that that goes without saying. I
Oh,
wouldn't
okay,
be
good.
here. I wouldn't be here if it wasn't. I mean, it hands down has been the most rewarding thing. I'm not gonna lie, like it's made life infinitely harder because I have to fly back to the US for a lot of work because I can't I work in Iceland a little bit, but there's just not enough work to sustain the type of work that I
Yeah,
do. And that's hard.
yeah,
But it also like I feel like when I'm here, I'm disconnected. I don't have people reaching out for me. I don't have to go,
good.
do that little thing here or there. I don't have to run down to LA or fly to San Francisco or whatever it is to like do that job or meet with that agency. And I feel like I get to like sneak a little bit under the radar. And again, like work pays a price and things pay a price, but you have to sacrifice for something that you love. That's the point of it, right? Like something's always got to
Yeah.
give. I don't know if you ever heard that analogy of the four burners, the four like burners like a stove, but I've always loved it where one burner represents family and one is work and one is health and one is relationships. Um, and I think to be successful, they say you have to turn off one burner. And to be really successful, you have to turn off two. And so I think I'm just at a point in my life, which is kind of silly to say, but I'm like, I don't want to make that sacrifice anymore. I don't want to, I've turned those down before and I feel like I've paid the price and that's just part of it.
Well, you said, the learning how to say no comes with maturity. I feel like
Mm.
you hit that level of maturity at a younger age than most people do. Obviously, my exposure to you was through surfing initially. I mean,
Mhm.
honestly, pre Instagram or any of that stuff. Um,
Mhm.
but even then, I remember your choices were very curated. Like you had a very clear um, mission of what you were trying to achieve. It was probably cold water in the North
Yeah,
Atlantic
yeah,
or something. Um,
it
but
was. You're spot on, 100%.
yeah, and so for me though, as somebody also kind of working in a creative environment, it's like you just need more work. I'll just take whatever work I can get, and I'm not necessarily trying to. Um, I'm not at the stage, or for most of your career, even when you transition to a stage where you can say no, you're
Yeah.
still under the mindset that you need to say yes to everything just because maybe
Dude,
it'll all go away.
I mean, this is literally my DNA. I grew up in a blue collar family. My family is still blue collar. My stepdad, my dad is he's a landscaper. And so growing up, that's what I did. I was digging ditches and mowing lawns. I mean, I'm, I thought that was my future. And ultimately, like the idea, I think you can relate to this. The idea of saying no to work is like sacrilegious. Like you might as
Totally.
well be like doing something that you should be punished for. And so I think that that mindset is super healthy, but all of a sudden when opportunities start coming and start unraveling, and you don't know how to say no, you become a workaholic. And then that takes its own toll. And then there's nobody to teach you that that's dangerous, right? This idea that like, that we wear our busyness as a badge of honor is so like messed up. And I don't want to offend anybody, but I will say that like being in Iceland and just also being in Europe, but specifically Iceland, like this hustle culture is not as much a part of this country, I feel. And when I'm in the States, I feel that. I get wrapped up in that personally. And I wanted to get away from it a little bit.
Good. Yeah, I'm glad. I want to hear you say this, and I want people to hear you say it as well, because we need reminders constantly. I mean, when you're living in the rat race,
Yeah.
there's like 10 layers of uh that you need to shed to even understand that
Yeah.
there's a different way to live.
Totally. And isn't it funny though? Because like nobody ever asks you like, oh man, dude, you've made it. Like you're enjoying life. Like that's so good. Like, are you stoked to be where you are? It's as if when you're stateside or when you're in the kind of that mentality, it's like, okay, well, what's next? Well,
Right.
what's next? And I honestly get like, it makes me cringe a little bit and feel irritable when I'm at an event or a book signing or whatever it is. What's next? And I'm like, dude, or what that not necessarily what's next, but like, what do you want to be doing in 10 years? And I'm like, I'm doing it. Like, this is it. If I was, you know, at an event, showing a film with people who were stoked to be here and sharing my experience and 10, like that would be the highlight. I'm not doing this because this is like, I have to do this. This is what I enjoy. And I've
Yeah.
been able to turn work or what I enjoy into work. And that's kind of the whole goal. So I guess it's just like that mentality that over here, people kind of, they get to a certain place and they understand like I make enough money to do what I need to do. And now the point and the goal is to do what you want to do. I don't want to work for the rest of my life. Like that's not the
Yeah.
goal. The goal is to be out in nature with people you love, right? Or
Yeah.
for me.
HelloFresh.com/freesurf. Surfing, food, and wine, those are my passions that occupy my time and my headspace. But as adulthood and fatherhood has demanded more and more of my time, the act of surfing has gone from a daily exercise to a weekly thing. And the same thing has applied with shopping for meals. It's so consuming, and honestly, it's a bit wasteful. Whether it's buying a jar of something that I only need a tablespoon of, or maybe just a bunch of celery when I only need 2 stalks of it, an embarrassing amount of groceries either go into the trash at the end of the week or they just rot in the cupboard for a year until I do a deep cleaning. So HelloFresh has really simplified and streamlined our dinner life with pre-portioned ingredients delivered right to our door. These are restaurant quality, easy to make meals with simple instructions, and it's also less expensive and healthier than any takeout that we order. And they have over 50 different recipes to choose from each week. The menus are seasonal. So this week we have autumn-inspired dishes like shepherd's pie if you want something filling, or there was an herbed salmon over apple and kale salad that was great last week. We also loved the creamy cilantro flank steak bowl with garlic lime rice and charred greens. And again, this is all delivered to our door, pre-portioned, and it's easy to make. So go to HelloFresh.com/freesurf to sign up. We will get you 10 free meals applied across 7 boxes. That's for new subscribers only, and it varies by plan, but it is 10 free great restaurant quality meals just by going to HelloFresh.com/freesurf. It is America's #1 meal kit for a reason, and in fact, one that I have been using since 2017, believe it or not. So that's HelloFresh.com/freesurf. I know we're not going to talk about origin story stuff
No,
necessarily, and that's
we
been
can.
covered.
I didn't mean to like, I just didn't want to, like give people what I feel like I've said on so many other
Exactly.
podcasts. And like,
That's what I was going to say. Like
yeah,
the first camera, all that stuff, they can go listen elsewhere. Um, I'm in Austin, Texas right now, by the way, and there's
I
deer
love
just
Austin. So
wandering our
awesome.
property. Look at,
That's epic. No way. Whoa, it's a buck too.
yeah, and there's
Yeah.
more over under
Wow.
the tree over there. You probably can't see him on this camera, But like as
Wow.
we're talking, they're just coming and going. He's eating a watermelon rind my wife threw out
That is
there.
something we do not see in Iceland at all, like animals like that. You'll see the occasional reindeer and sheep everywhere, but
Really? I thought that
nothing
you
like
would.
we get in the US.
Well, I said this was Austin. We're actually Lake Travis, if you know
Oh,
where that is, like
I
45 minutes away
don't.
from Austin.
Mm-mm.
But yeah, it's incredible property, or the kind of development around the lake is really cool. But there's deer, literally dozens and dozens and dozens of deer every day, all day, just meandering through the neighborhood. It's crazy. Anyways, origin story related question that I was going to ask you was
Yeah.
just when you kind of decide you want to be a photographer, what was the grandest vision of what a professional photographer could have been at that point? Obviously, print magazines are still in place, so it's probably related to that. But what did you think that you could do as a professional photographer? And then were your parents supportive of the idea?
Parents were not supportive. It was a huge point of pressure and pain sitting at the, dinner table at 20, 19 years old and telling my parents that I wasn't going to go to college. And I was the first person in my family who had like the grades to go to college, and I had financial aid money, and also I'm half Mexican, Native American, and so I had financial aid from that as well. And so it was a really hard conversation to advocate for what I wanted to do, which was be a photographer. But if I'm being truthful, being a photographer wasn't even the goal. I never even thought that
Okay.
that was cool. I thought that traveling was cool. And I grew up in a tiny micro town, no passport, nothing. You know, most of my childhood, it was single parent home, just me and my mom. And so the idea of seeing what was out there, that was the goal. And that still is the goal. Like when photography can take me to places, then I'm happy. That's what I want. And to be fair, like I know I'm kind of jumping around, but nowadays I don't even know that being a photographer is the label that I want, because I don't really care about the camera. It's not like this appendage that I wear. Like if I can experience new landscapes via skis or a bike, or just, you know, as a storyteller in an athletic pursuit, that's the dream, right? And when I get a chance to work with other creatives to help share a vision, that's the goal too. I love telling stories. Those stories are usually built upon landscapes that inspire me. But at the end of the day, it's still the same thought process. I think photography became the tool that got me there.
Yeah.
And I remember at 19 years old, kind of finding my place amongst like a rowdy group of boys who was just running up the coast of California surfing and, jumping under barbed wire fences and going out to these sharky waves and trying to get barreled. And I was sort of like the documentarian. And I think as a kid, you're looking to fill that gap. Like, what do you need? And I needed like brotherhood. I didn't have any brothers. I was young, and again, no parent in my life that was like a father figure. So I kind of like found my place in that, and I felt really empowered doing that. And so ultimately, that is kind of what led me to make that choice. Like, well, photography sounds rad. Like it gets me to be with friends, it gets me to go to places. I would flip through the pages of National Geographic and Time Magazine and Outside Magazine, and I would dream about going to those places. And I knew that being a journalist was probably not going to be the option, because I wasn't like a super, savvy student at school. I got great grades, but it just wasn't the path I wanted. I didn't want to go to school for 4 more years. And so I picked up a camera and I quit my job and I quit junior college at the time. And I was like, this is what I'm going to do. And I'm here now. And I kind of told myself at the time, I was like, I'm going to give this 5 years. If I'm face down in the dirt somewhere, that'll suck. But if I'm thriving, then that's what I'm after. So
Do you remember the first photograph you sold? First image?
I remember the first photograph I had published. I don't remember the first photograph I sold. I think the first picture I sold might have been an ad of Killian Garland, the surfer from Santa Barbara, California, to famous uh, wax or something like that. Um, I remember, yeah, I think so. But I do remember the first photo I had published was in like the newspaper at the college, at the junior college. And it was just like a slide photograph of mine of a wave up in like Central California. And it was just such a random photo, but I was very proud of it. I didn't get paid anything, but yeah, that was it. I
Um,
believe. I believe.
amazing. Um, well then as it relates to trying to make a living from surfing, do you remember the first surf trip that you were invited on as a photographer?
Yes. The first, I've been the lucky recipient of like some really um helpful people in my career. Um and a couple other photographers that I knew and that kind of were making a name for themselves during the same time that I was. Brian Nevins and just a lot of other guys like that. I remember an opportunity came up where one of them couldn't go, and they had kind of suggested me, and or they had reached out to me, or I can't remember what it was, but my first trip was to Dubai, Yemen, and Oman. And I'm not talking about like my first surf trip, like my first trip ever, like ever, like passport, fly somewhere. And you could say that there was culture shock, but that would be an understatement. And I remember very vividly filtering every complicated, nerve-wracking situation by pulling up a camera and like taking pictures. And I look at the photographs and they're just so shitty. Like there was zero connection. It was like I was shooting mannequins. And I dreamt of like walking away with these Steve McCurry portraits and everything. And there were moments like that for sure. I just had no freaking clue what I was doing. And the surf photos are cool. They're okay. We had an article that ran in Transworld Surf, and I had built a relationship with Transworld and Pete Terrace and the team over there because I had interned under Pete Terrace. And so it was really like I was in his good graces. He knew I was a hard worker. And I think that that is, ultimately the only reason why I got to go.
Who were the surfers on that trip?
Oh God, it was Nate Tyler. It was Harley Ingleby, the longboarder, I
Yeah.
think. I think. And it was Josh Hoyer. It was for a film, a 16 millimeter film that Dana Morris made called Beneath the Surface or something like that. He did like 5 or 6 trips, and I went on 2 of them. And I kind of got to like go back to back. And I had a relationship with Nate Tyler because he grew up in Central California and he was surf for Volcom and was an incredible aerialist and just great dude. And he had kind of, I think that, by the grace of God, I was able to somehow get on that. But I also went with that same crew or a similar crew, Sam Hammer, Harley Ingleby, whatnot, to Indonesia. So we went to the Mentawais and had an epic trip. And it was just, yeah, it was like things started to move forward. And it's interesting how that works, right? You get on the right trip with the right people and you sell and add to the right brand, and then you make a little bit of money and you try to take this tiny bit of money and make it go further, make it go further. And you realize that like, the better choices you make, or the better athletes you work with, the more likelihood you are to sell photos and et cetera, et cetera. But then at a certain point, you're like, well, I want to go to places that are more risky, more interesting, different. And after traveling the magazines at the time for 4, 5 years, I was kind of like, I wanted, to be on staff. I wanted to be a retainer photographer. And so I went to work for Surfline for many years, Surfline and Water Magazine when they were together. And then I eventually went to work for Surfer Magazine. And again, recipient of really just people who were kind of not necessarily looking after me, but like saw my promise or my talent and fostered that. And I really was appreciative. Joel Patterson, the editor, who worked at Transworld, and he was the editor when I was like an intern, low level intern. I think I talked to him twice. He went to work for Water Magazine to be the editor, and then he went to work for Surfer, and he kind of brought me along. And yeah, I mean, that became my whole identity was I was the surf photographer guy from California who, was getting death threats and posting photos on Surfline and, was, getting covers and people hated me or loved me. And that was just that's part of the job, right? When
Yeah.
when it was like really at the climax of what it was. And I don't know. I loved it. I miss it, and it's weird to say that there was a job title that I held and that people held that doesn't even exist anymore.
I know. So did you see the writing on the wall, or did you feel like there were stories to be told outside of the surf world? What was
It's
part of your
you're
transition?
It's a great question. So I saw the writing on the wall and I got out. I guess I don't know. I mean, getting out is a weird thing, but I was a retainer photographer for Surfer Magazine. I was a staff photographer making, my measly couple $1,000s a month or whatever. And I remember it came to kind of a head because like I was never the guy who was getting photos every month. I was the guy who like every 3 months would get a cover and a big article of some random out there place, and usually that was kind of my MO was like I would wait for those big trips, those more photojournalistic pieces. I would never go cover a contest and I'm not really like, gonna go, shoot a profile on Kelly or something like that. I would work with like a select group of guys and also love shooting in California and love documenting winter. So at a certain point, I was doing a lot of other work, a lot of commercial work. I started to sell photos to brands and companies and all that stuff. And that picked up to the point where I knew that I wasn't dedicating a lot of time to doing surf trips, or at least it was less and less and less. And, you know, I remember eventually I was on staff. I had a retainer at Patagonia and I was shooting a lot of work for Patagonia, climbing and surfing and some other stuff. And they had really taken me in, Jane Sievert, the editor over there. And I just remember having a call with Grant Ellis and, him kind of telling me that my retainer was going to be cut down or, whatever. And I just knew it was the right time. And I didn't really have a complaint. It was a bummer. And it was sad only because my ego was tied up in it. I was like, dude, if I'm not a surf photographer, what am I? If I'm not Chris Burkard, the staff guy, like who am I? And I knew that at that point, like most of my money wasn't even coming from the magazine. So it didn't matter.
Yeah.
But it was an identity thing. Like I had worked so hard for that title. I mean, I can't even express. I mean, I spent I was going out there. We had trips that like these trips weren't like run of the mill. Like, we were ending up in Russian jail cells and having to like fucking hide memory cards from police and shit like that because we were going to places that were oftentimes in some remote military base far into the world, visas that took a long time, India, Faroes, Norway, Alaska, Iceland, et cetera, et cetera. And I just felt like it was a tough transition, but it was the best thing for me for sure.
I mean, to be perfectly honest though, the economics of running those types of surf trips were less and less feasible for the magazines
They,
anyways.
they were. They were. And
And
I mean, there was multiple trips too where I was sort of, I was never told this directly, but it was like, hey, if you don't score, like we're not going to pay for this.
right.
I was
Yeah.
like, oh, okay, great. I'm married at 21 years old and I'm like maxing out credit cards, not telling my wife about these trips. And then all of a sudden, you go to God knows where and you barely come back with enough for an article. Like there were times where that happened. And I agree, it became less and less feasible. So I started to get creative. And eventually I was bringing on like random third party sponsors to kind of help, like outside the surf industry to kind of help tell these stories, and I think that hustle was deeply ingrained in me, and I tried to make it work. And I paid for a lot of trips by bringing on kind of other people to support it.
Yeah. It's fascinating. Um, do you, I mean, can you remember a first non-endemic opportunity that presented
Yeah, I
itself?
mean, it was all like surf related work because that's what I was known for and that's what I was hired for. And ultimately, it was my book, The California Surf Project, I did with Chronicle that actually got my work in front of non-surf audiences. And I've prioritized that my whole career. That was the biggest lesson I learned was like if you want to find success outside of the surf world, you have to get your work outside of the surf world because as you know, surfing, it's like miniature golf. It's like this tiny little microcosm world and you have a hard time getting out of that microcosm. It's like you're putting to this little tiny green where the hole is. and you think that that's it. You get up there to that mound and you look around, there's taller peaks all around you. You didn't see them, right? Like, and that's what it felt like is I didn't really realize because you become such a specialist. You have all this super expensive camera gear, a 600 millimeter water housings, et cetera, et cetera. You have a very special skill set, but it doesn't apply to anywhere else in the world or any other type of job. So anyway, my first images that I sold, I remember like a wine label reaching out to me and wanting to put one of my photos on a handbag. And I was like, a photo of a surfer walking through a field in California. California wine label. They wanted like some authentic California surf culture. And so they had seen my book and they had seen a photo and they reached out. And then again, like Daphne's California Greet, the restaurant, like the chain in San Diego or whatever. I've never eaten there. I don't know, but they were like, hey, we love your photos. We really want to buy them for the wall, like for a mural type of thing. And I was like, is this a print? Is this a print sale or is this like a commercial sale? And so I sold them an image and then it kind of furloughed, it just kind of, unraveled from there and opportunities started coming. And I realized like, well, what's interesting is that the hardcore surf photographs, like the pictures I had shot of Andy Irons and Baja or Kelly or, whoever in God knows where, like that stuff didn't matter. Nobody cared.
Yeah.
Maybe you could sell the occasional Billabong, Quicksilver, Volcom, whatever photo. But like, I was like, dude, there's this whole world over here that would rather buy, the esoteric anonymity of this lone athlete surfer in Big Sur or this person hiking on this trail or whatever it is, that's more relatable to the global scale. And so I think that I liked shooting that work. That's what I enjoyed. I was often shooting stuff like that with my friends, because that's what we were doing. It wasn't about the logos on their board and the front lit action. I hate that stuff. I've never enjoyed it. I felt like I got pressured into that because that's what the magazines wanted. And as I've explained in a million workshops that I've done, is like magazines, I love them and all respect, but they're run by advertisers. Advertisers are what pay for the magazine to happen and subscribers, of course. But like for the most part, those magazines I was working for, you needed to like be giving something back to the advertisers, right? Showing some logos, showing this. And so if everything I was shooting was like 2 miles away with like a 50 mil, some big wide landscape with a microscopic person, it doesn't really bode well for a career moving forward and like stoking out your editors and everything.
Yeah. The the greater world has a fascination with surfing. And so it's almost like you coming from that world, even if you can't, you know, make a legitimate living off of the surf world, being able
Yeah.
to tap into it occasionally and keep stoking that fire or whatever is still important, and gives you credibility to the
Yeah.
greater world. So,
I totally agree. And I've tried to figure out what that recipe is for many years. I was going on surf trips basically for next to nothing because I wanted to keep some sort of relevance. And that's
yeah,
it, not because I mean, yes, my ego needed it. It helped me like connect with my identity. And again, I have like a deep, deep relationship with the ocean and what it means to me, but it also was something where I felt like my best work was created there. And I always feel like it's
yeah,
important to get back to your roots. And I think after you have sat on a beach in Mexico with like a 90-person film crew and you're behind a monitor while someone's like lifting a Corona bottle and shooting a commercial, you start to wonder like, how did I even get here? This is so weird. This is so not me. And even though you're making a great paycheck, you start to, think romantically back to those times when you were just scraping by. And I love that stuff and I miss that. And I think that's what I really tried to reprioritize in my life.
it's like when you get out of the uh darkness immersion retreat and you need to go tap it back into it occasionally just to remember to reorganize your life in such a way.
I agree. It reprioritizes things.
um Obviously the importance of Instagram cannot be overstated. I'm
Mhm.
wondering if when it entered your world, if you identified it immediately as like an opportunity, like a marketing vehicle, basically. You've done a phenomenal job with it, obviously, but When did you
I,
identify
you
it
know,
as
I
something
don't,
that
I
could
don't know
be
about that. I feel like these days I'm like, I don't even understand what people want. I think that they just want like alpha males telling people how to live their life. I think that's pretty much what like most dudes want. It's
that's
like,
one major genre right now that our culture is obsessed with.
it's so fucking stupid. I hate it. Sorry, I don't know if I can swear on this podcast, but I'm just
Yes, you
like,
can.
I just that just nothing makes me gag more than seeing that shit. But yeah, I was actually a late bloomer to social media. It wasn't something that and also because I couldn't in the beginning when I was 2012 when it came out or something like that. I mean, it was Facebook first and then Instagram. I didn't have a Facebook forever. And I wasn't on Instagram until I think 2 years after it started. Like it was already going, and I remember the magazines being like, you know, totally anti. Like they were not into it. They were not open to the idea of sharing photographs while you're on assignment, of the places you are, maybe after everything's run or been published. And at that point, you're kind of like, you're on to the next thing. And I was on a trip with Alec Parker, surfer from the East Coast and rad dude, great guy, traveled a lot with him. He was like, dude, why aren't you on social media? This is such a great tool for photographers. And I like signed up and got on there. And I think the first photo I shared was a photograph of a gummy candy being warmed up in the heater vent in Iceland because it was so cold outside. I mean, I'm just sharing the level of quality that I was like putting out there. And it's obviously it has played a huge role, but I think that it's interesting because like and I don't want to be like, some self-congratulatory weirdo here, but like in the beginning there was no such thing as an influencer. That's like a
Yeah.
4 or 5 years ago thing, right? I've been on there for a long time at this point. In the beginning it was not about that. That was never something that I even imagined. I was a magazine photographer working for the magazine, sharing bits and pieces from my trips that the magazine wasn't choosing or wasn't using. And I think after I started to find a little bit of success, and the reason I think I found success in the beginning was because I was going on trips with athletes and then there was a magazine. And so we were triangulating what we were sharing. Like I would share a photo of them, they would reshare it, the magazine would share it. And it was kind of this, excuse my French, but like a circle jerk situation. And that's just, I think, how people found success. You get shared and reshared and blah, blah, blah. And then obviously I started to realize like, whoa, I'm getting, a lot of engagement here from these stories. And I was sharing excerpts from the stories. And I started to think about it as more like an editorial outlet. I started to put better work out there. I started to put my like best work telling the stories behind it. And I kind of realized like, wow, my voice people care about. My stories they value. And that's what it always was. And I have to say that's what it still is today. Or at least what I try and attempt to portray, because of kind of the complexities of social media and the opportunities that come with it. Nowadays, a lot of the commercial work I do, there's an element of it that is like social, meaning that I might go shoot a campaign for some catalog or whatever it is. This is something I just did. I just shot a campaign for Outdoor Research, the clothing brand. So we were shooting a new puffy jacket and all this stuff, and those assets are being used for their catalogs and marketing use. But then also there's a component where they're like, well, hey, you have, you know, as many followers as a small magazine or whatever it is. So like, can we also have you advertise this? And so it's kind of this double dip thing. And honestly, I don't think there's a situation ever where I am working with somebody where I'm not shooting something or creating something for them and then sharing it. Because I think the difference there is like, I'm not here to tell you about my skincare routine or sell you on some protein powder. Like I just try to utilize and collaborate with people that I know their product works or something that I'm using every day. And it seems
Yeah.
like it's been interesting. I don't really know where it's going, to be fair. Like I don't have the genie in the bottle and or the magic 8 ball because I feel like it is like the trends and where it's going. That that the app itself, obviously, it's not mine. I don't own it, so I can't complain very much because it is free at the end of the day,
Yeah.
essentially, even though the currency is time. And I think what's been really challenging for me is witnessing that, like, because the currency on social media is time, the more you spend on there, the more you're rewarded. And that's not where I want to spend my life, nor do I want to be putting stuff out there that's just rage bait, because that's the stuff that rises to the top because everybody's fascinated with, getting on there and, expressing their opinions, or they want us to like share our face and be a
Right.
personality. And that's fun. And I enjoy sometimes being the center of attention, trust me. But really it's about glorifying the places in nature and what I love.
Yeah, well, when I stated it as when did you identify it as a marketing vehicle initially? Is there are people who are using it just to showcase or maybe stay connected with their friends and family, and they're showcasing kind of
Totally.
very personal stuff. And then there's other people who have kind of identified it and as a way to kind of build their brand. But the distinction for you from other, I don't know, other surf photographers, uh, initially that I noticed was you using it to kind of tell the Chris Burkard story. Like
Right.
to access other surf photographers prior, I had to go through the magazines. And then there was a moment in time where I feel like you took control of your own story and then we're
Totally.
showcasing it on here. And so
Yeah.
now it was more valuable to follow you here than it was through Surfer Magazine, let's say.
I
So
I
you,
appreciate that. And to be honest, I think you have this experience, or at least you've witnessed, like, I'll pull up photos from my archive where I was like, dude, why didn't the editors choose this? They chose these 20 photos for the article. And I'm like, what about these 10 crazy images? Like, these are the ones I'm the most proud of. And that's what I started to put out there. And
yeah,
I realized that like my edits, my selection, kind of my photo edit was maybe more powerful. It told a different story. And I think that I became empowered through social media by telling those stories, and that was really cool. And I think that what it did is it gave me like a little bit of accolade to like feel like, oh, maybe I could direct a film, maybe I could make a book, maybe I could tell a bigger story, maybe I don't need the magazine anymore. And I think that now we've realized that we don't, really. Like, I
yeah,
think that all of us, we probably follow the surfers that really inspire us. We used to, as you said, have to access them through the magazines.
exactly. Yeah. Well, speaking of which what surf media do you follow at this point?
Surfer's Journal always. I think just because I respect it and I like what they put out, and I think that their photo selections are really well done and timeless. And then I almost feel like like the gossip queen, but I love Stab. Just the way that I honestly feel like they're the only actual media, like media outlet out there that's kind of sharing something interesting. And some of it's pretty clickbaity and a little bit not my favorite. I think they've gotten way better. I think they've stepped into a level of professionalism that's actually really inspiring. And I know all those guys, and they've done a great job, and they've grown, and it's been awesome to see. But I would say also just trying to keep a pulse on what's happening. But I genuinely feel like I'm not the person to ask, about what's cool in surfing, because I genuinely don't know. I'd probably ask you, um, first and foremost, because I just feel like I'm a little bit out of touch, or at least my taste is different.
Yeah. What who's surfing do you admire currently?
Oh man. I mean, it's kind of funny, but like I don't know that there's anybody currently like who is a current star that I am in love with, as opposed to like I used to love shooting and working with the Malloys, the Ghadauskas brothers, Josh Mulcoy, the boys from Santa Cruz, a lot of the original kind of East Coast crew, Alec Parker, Peter Mendia. Those were the people that I really was moved by. And because they were consummate travelers, these are people who like saw the globe, and it reflected in the way that they did that. I mean, still Shane Dorian, huge inspiration. I would say, um, yeah, I mean, Aton Osborne, just because I've traveled with him and he's a good kid. I don't think he's somebody that I would normally gravitate to, but I have such a deep respect for him because of where he came from. And I know the type of waves that he grew up in because I grew up in those too. And yeah, I don't know. I'm not like, yeah, Griff, he's just magic. I just though there it's fun to watch, but it feels mechanical to me a little bit. And
Yeah.
and no offense to Griff because he's a legend and I love that kid and I've traveled with him too. I'm just saying that like a lot of surfing feels formulaic, feels a bit
Yeah.
like pageantry. When I see a surf contest, I'm like, this is like a play, and it
Yeah.
just I just not inspired by that. I think that the Rostovich Malloy era was the era that I appreciated the most.
Rosta's having a
Moment.
second coming right now. Yeah, it's amazing.
Yeah, the second coming, the Christus.
Exactly. Second coming of the Yeti.
Hide your
Um,
wife, hide your girlfriend.
uh, can you think of the best surfing that you've ever seen?
Best surfing I've ever seen was Dan Malloy on a typhoon swell in Japan about 3 hours before we had to catch a flight. It was the single best day of waves I've ever witnessed. And Dan, we shot the cover. We went to Japan for like 10 days. We surfed 0 days. It was dog shit the whole time. And Kohei Chiba, who's basically the Jerry Lopez of Japan, and who Jerry Lopez was with us. He took off, and I was like, basically strangling myself because I had this opportunity to shoot with Jerry Lopez and Dan Malloy in Japan. This Patagonia trip, it was all time. We were there during the peak season. We just didn't get a typhoon or whatever. And pretty much what happened was like Kohei was like, there's gonna be a swell tomorrow. Like it's gonna be good. And we had looked at this point break every day and it was just terrible. And all of a sudden, of course, that morning we went to the beach early. Our flight was at like 11 and we got there at like 6 a.m. And me and Dan were just like, holy shit, it looked like Rincon on crack. It was like the length of Rincon, 3 times the size with huge barrels. And Dan was just like, I've never seen a wave this perfect. Again, it was like sand spit mixed with Rincon, mixed with El Cap. And as you can imagine, you've got one of the best goofy foots in the world, or sorry, regular foots in the world on one of the best right hand waves. And it's like peaking backlit, all the stereotypes that I love, backlit rocks, offshore. Dan does this turn. I only got like maybe 3 good photos, 3 good like sequences. One of his first waves, he does this turn that to kind of give you context, the old emblem, like the old little emblem for Surfer Magazine that they would put at the end of the articles was a little turn of Tom Curren. Do you remember that? This little
Yes,
tiny, yeah, it was the classic Tom Curren at Rocky Point or whatever it was, shot by Tom Survey, iconic, or maybe
it was Tom Survey.
yeah, I think it was Tom Survey. Yeah, the
Yeah.
iconic image, right? They were like, we're gonna replace that with this photo. We're gonna replace that with this emblem. And I was like, oh my God, this is like my moment. I remember Surfer's Journal and Surfer Magazine arguing over the photo. And this has happened twice for me. And just full disclosure, I've never had a photo, I've never had a cover of the journal. I've had a back cover, and I've had 2 photos that they wanted as the cover, but Surfer wanted it too. And I remember like telling Dan, I'm like, dude, what do you want? Do you want a photo of the journal? Do you want a cover of the journal or do you want to cover a Surfer magazine? And I wanted to cover the journal. And I remember Dan and Chris were talking and they were like, and I think it was Chris who was like, he told me, he's like, I think you should go a Surfer because, you know, there's a chance that in Dan's life or career, he might have another photo of the journal, another cover of the journal someday. But the opportunity to get one of Surfer is like, might not ever happen. And that was his last cover of Surfer magazine. And it was awesome. And it was a highlight experience.
That's so rad. I mean, to be honest, Chris's rationale is pretty solid.
Yeah,
Like
I
he
mean,
makes a good
the
point.
guy's
You
a
can't argue
smart,
against it.
smart fucking dude. Yeah.
Um, but man, Dan is such a great surfer. Dan is like, and still to this day, like a rad human being. Like, cannot say enough good things about him. So I'm glad to hear you mention him.
And it was wild because, it was kind of like a bit of a full circle moment. Like Dan was my favorite surfer growing up. Um, like the person that I was like always like, oh, if I could just like get on a trip with that guy or whatever, whatever. And to have that come to life was like, it still feels surreal. I get like goosebumps thinking
Yeah.
about it. That was meant to
Yeah.
be. And yeah, it was crazy.
Is there any surf trip you still want to go on that you haven't been on yet?
I mean, there's a million, and
Okay.
honestly, what I think has become tough is like the places that are interesting to me are so out there and so far at this point that I know that the budgets that it would require or the effort that it would take, I just don't even know that it's possible now because I'm looking, I'm not looking at like Iceland anymore because that's been done a million times and I've done it many times, but the Kerguelen Islands and the Kurils and back to the Aleutians and these remote wild places where I know and I've seen waves because I've been there for other projects and they're insane, and they're incredible. And like we're talking the most culturally, you know, interesting place you could ever go in your entire life where it feels like, ancient civilizations just basically left everything they ever had and you're seeing that and you're seeing waves. So to me, it's out there. Like the exploration and the opportunity is out there. It's just a matter of, budget and time. And I don't quite know the brands that are willing to pay that for that stuff these days, and I know
Yeah.
that you know that too. And I've worked with all of them and I've tried to convince all of them and I got pretty close with a couple. Um, but yeah, I think that the opportunity, I think Ben Weiland, my good friend and an incredible filmmaker and just a talented individual, he's still really trying to pioneer and push the envelope and explore places. But I mean, him and I chat all the time about, I think, some of the limitations that we feel because it's a bummer because we know what's out there. We've done the
Yeah.
research, talked to fishermen, like we've put in our time, and this is why we've been successful, I think. And it's a bummer to know that we might not get there in our life.
I'm glad you mentioned Ben because I was going to ask you if there's any young up and coming photographers or filmmakers who you do admire and you enjoy. So Ben is one of them. Is there anybody
I
else?
mean, there are a lot of young photographers that I feel like at this point they're not young anymore because when I was kind of coming up, what's interesting is I was doing this like pretty early on. I didn't go to college, so that all that time people spent partying. I was not partying. I was like grinding, living in my truck, trying to drive the California coast to make a name for myself. So it was really interesting when like I kind of did the surf thing and got out of it by the time that some guys who were older than me were just getting their moment. And so there have been a lot of amazing people. And it's also sad to see some dudes who are really talented kind of come and go,
Yeah.
or at least like not be able to make it. But um, my era really was kind of that like post, I mean, and I'm gonna get nerdy here, but like post Dustin Humphries, he kind of, I think, paved the way for a lot of people, maybe people like myself who wanted to shoot in that style. I always think of it like there's the flame era, which is kind of like the front lit, this and that, and which is amazing. And he, paved the way. And then, a lot of guys in between, the Aaron Changs, the Tom Surveys, the blah, blah, blah. And then there's sort of like the Dustin Humphries and the guys that I guess came after that, that were kind of trying to shoot more backlit, more pulled back, more lineup focused, more, it was the era when you could get a cover of Surfer magazine where a dude was like this big, Patrick Trev's big inspiration. Nowadays we have, there's a talented group of guys. I just barely get to see it. There's not like a place where I'm like honing in and able to kind of like flip through. I go through the Surfer's Journal and I'm like, I've barely heard of any of these people,
I know.
Um,
Yeah.
but I think that the filmmakers have made a little bit more of a name for themselves because there's more consistency. And Ben is still just one of the most talented guys I know, and he can tell a narrative story really well, which I feel like is what I'm interested in. I was obviously a huge fan of the Kai Neville era and that whole thing, but I think that um, it ran its course a little bit, just in my opinion, and not totally sure kind of what I don't even know what like the pinnacle of surf action is these days.
Yeah.
You
From
know,
a filmmaking standpoint, I don't either.
right? I mean, I think like we've kind of seen it all, done it all, when sipping jet streams and all of that came out, it to me that was like the pinnacle,
Yeah.
it was the moment, McCullough and Dorian and Mike Lostness and these guys, going Rizal Chengjiang, going to these remote places. Like to me, like I still can't think of a better film.
Agreed. Yeah. The the surf porn kind of thing.
Mhm.
they have a new version of Trilogy out where it's
Yeah,
Ethan Ewing, Griffin Colapinto, and Seth Moniz. And it's
little
like
rough.
the action's amazing, right? And
Yeah.
there are some new interesting camera angles and stuff, but it's like I don't know that this needs to be a full-length feature film. Like the style of what you're doing might be best displayed on Instagram or in a 3-minute YouTube
Right.
clip or something like that.
Or I also wonder if like that, I guess it's tough too. Maybe, you know, and again, like I'm not the consumer here. Like I don't buy surf clothes. So I don't, I'm like the worst person to talk to, right? But I also wonder if like they would have gotten more bang for their buck just cutting that thing into like 100, 30-second clips and like putting it online. Probably more
Right.
people would have seen it and they
Right.
might have actually generated more income. I just always find it weird, like when I make a film about whatever, like I'm usually at those premieres, I'm sharing the film, I'm talking about the project. And I don't want to say that what I'm making is better than anybody's. It's just what is speaks to me, but I couldn't really imagine making a film where I don't have something to say or talk about or share in like a slideshow or getting up. I'm just like, you know what I mean? Like I picture those film screenings are like, yeah, we shredded Indo. It was so sick. Like, thank you to the Indies Trader 5 and thank you to the drone pilot. Like, you know what I mean? Like to me, the trips that we were doing and the films that we were working on back then, it was like this deep immersive experience where like we were bonding as people, we were struggling, going through shit and pitching up a tent and -20 or whatever it was. And so I guess there's like there's story, there's something rich there.
Yeah.
I think that, I guess I just feel like it's hard when I look back and I see some of the classic surf films that really paved the way. I'm like, it's hard to think about something being better than those.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Well, what final kind of wrap up questions? What is your current relationship like with surfing?
Well, see this? That's my hand plane right there. That's
Yep.
probably my current relationship with surfing. Living in Iceland, it's a lot of very thankless sessions. That's the beauty of it. You're not out there like to document everything you're doing. You're not, run into a Starbucks in a, cement parking lot. It requires actual real psycho levels of dedication to like make it happen. And I love it. I love witnessing the surf culture here just thrive and people so dedicated, more dedicated than myself, go out there all the time. And honestly, it feels cool to be a part of something like that. When I get back to California, I surf more inevitably because it's warm. But I mean, I never, you know, I was never much of a shortboarder. I always enjoyed longboarding. That was always something that I just felt was like the most fun. But being a water photographer and having to put all my effort into that early on, and just trying to train in some capacity, I feel like I fell in love with a pair of flippers and a boogie board and or a hand plane. So if I go out in the water, it's usually body surfing. You're never dissatisfied body surfing. You're always getting barreled, and that's all I really want to do. It's like I just want to
Yeah.
in a tube, like I want to feel that experience, and that's what leaves me satisfied. And so, yeah, like I am that person who's always looking for that remote, unique little like hidden wave deep in a fjord, or even at my house in California, that big south swell that's going to pour some like wedge into a corner. And that's where I want to be. Like,
How often or how frequently can you get in the water in Iceland?
I mean, if you're on it, you could surf every day. I mean,
Okay.
there's waves every day. It's an island that is not that big. And, you could drive around the whole thing in probably 25 hours.
Okay.
Um, And so there's always swell somewhere. There's always somewhere that's going to be good. It's just like a matter of chasing the wind and the current and kind of what's happening, with the tides and everything like that. But it is pretty fascinating how many good waves there are here and how much rich of a surf culture there is.
What's the warmest that the water gets?
What's wild is I remember one year I came here with Sam Hammer and Mike Gleason. We shot a cover of the Surfer photo annual, and it was a hurricane leftover. Like it had spun, it was like a nor'easter or whatever it was. No, no, it was a hurricane. It was October and it had spun off the eastern seaboard and came up. And we were here, we flew in for it, and the waves were insane, but it was so warm. It was like we were wearing 4.3s, no booties, no gloves, and we were like flushing our suits. Like it was, I've never felt anything like it. You could notice the warmth of the water.
Wow.
Yeah. And it's
Okay.
honestly, it's like that more than I realized a lot. Like guys are still right now wearing no booties, no gloves, right?
Wow.
And it's really like that kind of deep winter, like November starts to get cold, spring is proper cold, and that's the time where it gets the hardest.
Gotcha. Cool.
Classic.
Well, right on, man. Thank you so much for taking the time 2 times,
Oh,
last week and
thank
this week. I
you.
apologize for missing last week.
Dude, no worries, man. Yeah.
Really appreciate that. And yeah, I appreciate, and I'll give people direction if they want to hear the story of the Russian jail or whatever, they can go hear that on Rich Roll or wherever else. So I appreciate you going deep into the other stuff and the personal experience of the
Oh, man, we could talk forever. I love this stuff. You know, honestly, I love your podcast. And I think that these types of opportunities give me a moment to reminisce a little bit and romanticize about those glory days. And I just appreciate it. And yeah, I think once a surfer, always a surfer. So I'm just thinking about getting in the water.
yeah, good. Glad to hear it. Glad I could inspire you in that way. All right, man. Thanks.
Yeah. Thanks, David.
All right, bye.
Surf Splendor.